Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I hope that you're doing exceedingly well. Tonight's story is definitely going to pull at your heartstrings because we know that Bigfoots can be very aggressive and very dangerous, but we also do know of people that have had the most phenomenal encounters with Bigfoots, where Bigfoots have not only rescued them from tragic disasters, but also where Bigfoots have transformed and changed their lives. And this story is no exception to that. We all know how the 9/11 disaster really impacted each and every one of us, whether we were alive at the time or not. It clearly left its indelible mark on our lives. And this woman, her story is no different. So I think it's going to really touch your heart because she tells us how she gets through the 9/11 disaster because of a Bigfoot. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I ask that I may remain anonymous in this story because I don't want my details going public, if you don't mind. I have an extraordinary Bigfoot encounter to share with you and your listeners that brought me so much joy and hope amidst the deep, dark sadness that engulfed and cloaked my life like a black, oppressive cloud for a very long time. This ugly darkness was so pervasive that it literally sucked the marrow from my bones and all the hope in my heart like a ravenous vampire bat. If it had not been for my encounter with a hairy humanoid that many like to call Bigfoot, I truly do not think that I would have pulled through my harrowing, horrendous ordeal. It was Bigfoot that brought a bright sparkle into my life like a colourful, ravishing golden sunset. It was this elusive, mysterious, hairy humanoid that I chose to call Puffin that brought a smile to my face and laughter to my heart, and for that I will forever be grateful and indebted. Puffin taught me that life is indeed exquisitely beautiful, and that each new day is a precious gift of God, a brand new beginning, where the opportunities are boundless, and the secret to enjoying life is to embrace every single second with a thankful, grateful, and appreciative heart. In short, my husband tragically died in the 9/11 attack at the World Trade Center. This was when the Twin Towers came crashing down due to planes flying into the building, although many conspiracy theories abounded, suggesting that it was, in fact, a controlled demolition. Either way, and whatever you may believe, this tragic event brought the city of New York to its knees, and the rest of the world looking on in horror and in utter revulsion. It was an indelible footprint in American history that will never ever be forgotten, nor all the precious men and women that tragically lost their lives on that fateful day. They too will never ever be forgotten. Like so many of your listeners that were around at the time of the New York Twin Tower attacks, I always remember what I was doing on that fateful day, as invariably most people do. I remember that I got up at 6:30 a.m. that morning. That was much earlier than usual for me. I recall having butterflies in my stomach as I sensed that something was distinctly off. I could feel that it was going to be one of those less than favourable days, so to speak. I do not know how I sensed it, but I did. I often wonder how many other people had a gut feeling that things were going to go wrong on that day. My husband told me that he had a pounding headache that morning, and I tried to encourage him to take the day off, but he was so ethical and conscientious as far as his job was concerned, and after downing a couple of paracetamols, he kissed me on the cheek, told me he loved me, and that was the last time I ever actually saw him alive. It was at 7 a.m. when I decided to take my little Scottish terrier for a brisk walk, and when I came back half an hour later, I did feel invigorated and refreshed, but I still had this horrendous feeling in my gut that something very bad was about to happen. I'm not an intuitive person by any manner of means, but on this day something didn't feel right. I know all these years later that you need to listen to your gut because, believe me, it doesn't lie. I decided to distract myself by preparing the menu for a dinner party I was hosting the following Saturday evening for some of my husband's work colleagues. I remember my husband telling me that one of our dinner guests was a pescatarian, and I was not sure what that actually meant, so I called my husband. It must have been about 8:30 when I called him. At this time he was still in his office, and I asked him how his headache was, and he told me that it had thankfully gone. Then I asked him what pescatarian actually meant, and he told me that it meant that the person only eats fish. I proceeded to tell him how much I hated fish, but because of this punctilious, fastidious guest that was coming to dinner, I was now relegated to serving everybody fish. My husband assured me that I could just serve the pescatarian fish and everybody else something different. But what if all my guests secretly wish they have the fish when I serve them lamb instead, I said. Who in their right mind would favour sea bass over your tender, juicy lamb? Said my husband. I was getting heated. Yes, but supposing they really wish they were having the fish, I insisted. Well, then give them a choice, said my husband. Ask them what they would prefer to eat, sea bass or lamb. It's not that complicated, he said. You're a genius, I said. Well, I have to be, don't I, married to you, he said. It's pretty straightforward, I told you. What about pudding, I asked. Do you think I should do something fresh like lemon syllabub, or something sickly and sweet like sticky toffee pudding? Something sickly and sweet, said my husband. The men will appreciate a hearty English-style dessert. And besides, who in their right mind doesn't enjoy a sticky toffee pudding? I know it's Madonna's favourite. Before I could answer my husband, suddenly I heard this catastrophic clanging, walloping, banging and crashing sound, which to date was the most horrendous sound that I have ever heard in my life. In that instant my hair was standing on end, and my heart was starting to pound violently like a heavy drum, and I felt my whole body rattle and shake. Then I heard these terrifying screams, and I heard my husband's frantic voice saying, "Calm down, everybody, calm down. It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. Calm down." "What's going on?" I cried at the other end of the line. "What's going on?" I could hear all these terrified shuffles and screams and people saying, "We're going to die, we're going to die." There were sobbing sounds, gasps, whimpers, howls and cries, and people going on about how scorchingly hot it was and how they couldn't breathe. It was like my biggest nightmare had come to life. "What's going on?" I cried at the other end of the line. "What's going on?" "I love you, babe," said my husband's solemn voice, picking up the phone. He was gasping for breath and was wheezing, heaving and choking as he spoke to me. Everything was happening so fast. "Something's happened. A plane has crashed into the building, and the place is filling with black smoke. It's almost impossible to breathe in here, and it's sweltering hot. I don't think we're going to make it. But don't forget that I love you. You're my world. Never forget that." "Please don't put the phone down. Please don't put the phone down," I sobbed. "I love you, babe," he said, choking. And those were his last words. I will never forget how I felt at that moment I heard the crash into the World Trade Center on the phone. And that memory will be imprinted on my life for all eternity. I cannot forget it. It is something you just can't forget. It was so hauntingly traumatic. I do consider myself to be one of the lucky ones to have actually spoken to my husband moments before his death, as many loved ones never got that chance. I was fortunate enough to tell my husband that I actually loved him. I did watch on the horrifying coverage on the television, but because my husband was struggling to breathe on the phone due to the black smoke, I knew immediately that he had not made it. In some ways, knowing that he had died was a lot better than all those people hanging on to the vain hope that their loved one had pulled through, only to discover later that they were well and truly gone. Not knowing has got to be the worst thing of all as far as I'm concerned, because it leaves you in a suspended state of helplessness and hope. This harrowing, unforgettable disaster was a moment that America was united by the most terrible grief that shook the fabric of our lives apart infinitely. America would be forever transformed by this compounding shared grief that touched the lives of every single living American and the entire world. Of that I am in no doubt. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and I was still in a dreadful emotional turmoil. I had lost so much weight that my cheeks were now sunken in and hollow. Food held no appeal to me whatsoever, and I did not really take much care with my appearance either. I just didn't care anymore about anything or anyone, and getting up every morning was an arduous ordeal. I was suffering from a deep, heavy depression that just would not shift. The loss of my husband just filled me with the most devastating grief, and nothing I did made my life any happier. I had tried the grief counselling route, the church services, seeing friends and relatives, but nothing helped. I remember sinking emotionally into such a gloomy place of dreadful despondency that I just didn't want to go on living anymore. I seriously considered downing a whole bunch of pills with a bottle of brandy and being done with this grievous, hostile world of ours. It just seemed like the world had become a dark, miserable place, and I had lost all faith and hope in humanity. How could there be such evil people out there who hated America so much that they wanted to tear our world apart like this, I wondered. I will say that there were times I did feel my husband's comforting presence around me, although I did tell myself it was wishful thinking. But now I'm almost certain my husband was revealing to me that he was still around. But in my overwhelming grief, it was so hard to perceive that that was even remotely possible. My favourite colour in the entire world is blue, and when my husband proposed to me 10 years earlier, he presented me with a bunch of blue flowers and a single blue balloon. One morning when taking my Scottish terrier Moggy for a walk, the most extraordinary thing happened. A young girl came up to me with a blue flower in her hand and said, "I wanted to give this to you." Then a short while later, a blue balloon went floating past me, and I suddenly grabbed it. I felt sure it was from my husband. I really felt as if I could sense his presence. I know that sounds crazy, but I really did. That night when I went to bed, I had a very vivid, evocative dream. My husband was dressed all in white, and he stepped forward with a bunch of blue flowers and a blue balloon in his hand, and he had a big beam on his face, and he said, "You need to go to Tennessee. Leave tomorrow." Now, I want to stress that I knew nothing about Tennessee. Yes, I had fleetingly heard about the place, and I knew Dolly Parton came from that part of the world. I do recall there was a song, "My Tennessee Mountain Home," or something like that. I had lived in New York all my life and had never been to that part of America before. But the dream had been so lucid and so arresting that I was determined to listen to my husband's words, and so I booked a little cabin for myself for a couple of weeks to stay at the Tennessee countryside, and I decided to take Moggy with me, and off we both went. So there I was, staying in a sumptuously cosy, rather remote but very idyllic cabin in the Tennessee countryside, surrounded by glorious views overlooking majestic blue mountains, green undulated rolling hills, fields of pretty wild flowers, and areas of vast forest that literally stretched back for miles upon miles. For me personally, the icing on the cake was an exquisite silvery lake that was flanked on either side by a wooded area, and it was such a beautiful spot to watch the deer congregating to drink. Moggy was in his element, enjoying the fresh air, and everywhere he went, he would lift up his leg to leave a scent mark to tell the entire world that he'd been there. I have never seen my little Scottish terrier more exhilarated and more enthusiastic or exciting about anything before in his life. He looked like he'd died and gone to heaven, and practically insisted on rolling his back on every available piece of turf to extend his scent profile as far afield as was physically possible for him, to let every possible animal know that he had been there. It was like the countryside had made him deliriously drunk with happiness, and for the first time in ages, I did manage a fleeting smile. I still remember the sunset that evening. It was more resplendent than anything I've ever seen in my entire life. I watched the whirling folds of yellows, tangerines and pinks moulding together in exquisite, alluring shades that quite literally took my breath away. In that moment I knew that I had done the right thing coming here to Tennessee. Maybe there was something healing and regenerating about this crisp mountain air after all. The following day I decided I'd take a walk to the silvery lake and then into the woods. I could not remember the last time I'd enjoyed some fresh air and exercise. I prepared myself a picnic lunch of a few ham and tomato sandwiches, crisps and some Mountain Dew, and a couple of bananas, and I wrapped up a nice juicy meaty bone for Moggy, and off we went on our walk. I do remember it was a radiantly beautiful day. The sun was shining. It wasn't too hot, just the way I liked it. As I walked, I admired the beauty of everything around me. Soon I approached the lake. Everything was reflected in the glistening surface of the water like a large mirror. I watched some wild duck skimming across the surface, and I noticed a gorgeous fish-eagle on a branch looking over the water with his beady dark eyes. He did not fly away when he saw me, which I thought was incredibly amazing. He was magnificent and majestic. Moggy was sniffing the ground and wagging his tail and encouraging me to enter the wooded area close to the lake. I guess I did not require much persuasion, because I dutifully followed him. The woods were exquisite and were filled with white pines, oaks, dogwoods, and maples. I guess you could say it was late summer, merging into autumn, so there was a little treefall on the ground, which was very pretty. And as I walked through the woods, I suddenly felt all the heaviness in my chest welling up to the surface like the bubbles in a pot of boiling water. The next thing I knew was that I started to sob and sob and sob. It had been 3 weeks, and I'd physically fought back those tears. But now I was sitting on the forest floor, sobbing my heart out, like I've never cried before. Suddenly I heard the strange chattering sound, and I looked up through my tears to see what was making that peculiar noise. The only thing I could liken the noise to was that to the sound of a monkey, but I saw nothing. Moggy was wagging his tail at something and letting out some excited yaks, so I threw him his bone, which he started to chew with great gusto. The next thing I knew was that pretty blue flowers were being thrown at me, but where were they coming from? I did not know. Once again I looked around and saw nothing, but I kept hearing that strange chattering sound. I was sitting under a large oak tree, and I just so happened to look up, and there in the branches was a huge colossal creature, the likes of such that I have never seen before. At that time I'd never heard of Bigfoot because of living in New York. Creatures like that are not usually discussed. I could not make out what this creature actually was. It looked like it was half ape and half human, and this thing was monstrously huge, but he had such a cheerful, funny disposition. I was not afraid of him at all. The creature bounded out of the tree now that I'd seen him, and sat down several yards away from me, eyeing me curiously with a keen interest and intrigue. He was covered from head to toe with hazelnut hair, and he must have weighed about 600 pounds and been about 7 feet tall. Every part of his body rippled with dense muscle, and I do remember he had huge shoulders and a very distinct bullet-shaped head, with virtually no neck to speak of. His long face was a dark brown colour and looked like dark shiny leather, and he had a very distinct brow ridge, very flat nose, and sparkling brown eyes. I opened my ham sandwiches and threw him one. The creature discarded the bread and gobbled up the ham and tomato, and then began to mimic me. When I proceeded to eat my sandwich, he was so funny that I started choking on my sandwich, and I was laughing so much, and then he started imitating my choking, and then he started imitating all my laughing, which made me laugh all the more. I do not remember ever laughing this much. Pumped up by my enthusiasm, the creature decided to show off by swinging from one tree to another, giving me amazing display of his acrobatic prowess and his incredible agility. He did strange twists and turns that were so seamless that he would have made a ballet dancer appear clumsy. I began to clap, and then he imitated my clapping with an animated expression on his face. I was literally rolling on the forest floor, my stomach aching because I was laughing so much as his imitations of me were absolutely hilarious. The creature then began to throw some more blue flowers at me, like he would throw confetti at a bride. "How do you know I love blue?" I asked the creature, knowing full well the creature didn't understand my words, but he regarded me with very inquisitive eyes and chattered away jubilantly. He was so beautiful, and my heart was flooded with this incredible warmth. For the first time in ages I was feeling incredibly happy. I threw my packet of salted potato crisps at the creature. He played with the packet, tossing it up and down like a ball, catching it every time. He then threw it a fair distance away, and then began to catch it. He was so majestic, powerful, and agile, and was so beautiful to watch, because his movements were seamlessly graceful. After a while he opened the crisps, and after sniffing, examining, and tasting the crisps, he dived into them with an exuberant gusto, demolishing them all in a few seconds. He licked his chops appreciatively, and once the bag was empty, He put on an exaggerated, sad expression on his dark, leathery face, causing his wrinkles on his brow ridge to deepen significantly. He then showed me the empty bag, and he looked very, very sad. He surreptitiously pointed to my 2 bananas on the ground, and I threw them to him, and he munched them away eagerly with the skins on, observing me with an inquisitive curiosity all the while. I started to laugh. "You want more, don't you?" I said. "That's all I've got, but I'll bring you some more tomorrow." The creature gathered some of the blue flowers he had thrown at me and started to make a necklace out of flowers for me. "What?" I thought in shocked amazement. "How does this creature know about necklaces, let alone how to make them out of flowers?" I wondered. The creature worked with the flowers tirelessly, and I was amazed at his dexterity and nimbleness of his chubby sausage-sized fingers and huge monstrous hands. How was it possible to make something so delicate with such massive hands? He tossed the flowery necklace towards me and indicated for me to put it on my neck, which I did. It was so incredibly pretty. He made one for himself and a smaller one for Moggy. We were all now wearing blue flowery necklaces, but Moggy registered his displeasure by tearing his flowery collar to shreds in no time at all. I got up to leave the woods and waved to the creature. "See you in the morning," I said with a big smile on my face. That evening I ate a hearty meal, and for the first time in ages I felt as if the heaviness had dissipated. I did feel lighter and happier. Every day the hairy ape-like creature was in the woods waiting for me, and even Moggy, my dog, had grown attached to him. On this occasion I brought the creature a hairbrush, and to my amazement he absolutely adored being groomed. It took me about 3 long hours to brush out his long, tangled, human-like hair, but he chatted away happily while I did this, sometimes letting out a rather uncomfortable cry when I got to a tangled part of his hair. I guided the creature finally, once I'd finished, to the shimmering lake so that he could see his reflection in the water. I must admit his hair just gleamed in the midday sun, and the creature was amazed by how he looked. He studied his reflection closely and stroked his mane in awe, and he kept saying, "Oop, oop, oop," as if he just couldn't believe how fantastic he looked. He also let out a few happy whooping sounds, and then proceeded to brush his own hair all on his own, while admiring his reflection. I think he could not believe the transformation, and he loved his hairbrush. I also brought the creature a Rubik's cube, which I thought he might like, and I was not wrong. He loved it, and he understood the game immediately. I struggled to understand those cubes and to get those colours together, but this creature had absolutely no difficulty at all, and when he watched me struggling away with it, he was very puzzled that I found it at all challenging. Every time I went into the woods, we played together, and as weird as it sounds, it felt as if I'd made the most amazing friend, because he really was such a special creature. One day we gathered some very late berries together. The hairy humanoid stuffed his mouth with the berries, and his face became very fat and puffy. When we went to relax under the oak tree, the creature emptied out his cheek pockets, much like a squirrel does, and proceeded to enjoy eating the berries one by one. It was really amusing to watch. I must admit it was with great sadness that I did finally have to leave Tennessee and say goodbye to my mountain friend, whom I've never ever forgotten, and remember with such a keen fondness. It was truly this awe-inspiring creature that brought me the light to my dark world, and hope to my hopelessness. And truly, if I had not met this creature, I doubt that I'd be here today to tell you my story. When I got back home to New York and did some research, I realized that Puffin was a Bigfoot. I also learnt that many people had experienced terrifying encounters with these creatures, and for them I'm truly sorry, but Puffin, he was an altogether different creature, a unique one, I'm in no doubt about that. I started dating a very nice gentleman that had very similar qualities to my late husband. One day he took me on a date but arrived at my house with a huge bunch of blue flowers. Can you believe it? "How do you know I love blue flowers?" I asked him. "I didn't," he said. "I was actually buying you some red roses when there was a voice in my head that just told me, don't get her red roses, but get her those blue flowers instead. So that's what I did." I'm now happily married to this man today, and I have 2 beautiful children. So to all you listeners out there, don't get discouraged by the darkness and the hopelessness that you might be experiencing in your life right now. It all happens to us, but sooner or later the light will break through that darkness, because it did for me. So there you are. That's my story. Thank you so much for that gorgeous story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.